Yeah, there was a gangster by the name of Ernie the Hawk Rupolo, Genovese guy, and allegedly he was an informant, informed against Vito Genovese. Not a good idea. And there was a contract put on his life, and my father, Sonny Franzese, was accused of his murder. I don't believe it, and I'm going to tell you why. Everyone, welcome to another Sit Down with Michael Franzese. As always, I hope everybody is doing well. Everything is very blessed on this end. What am I going to do today? There is a series on YouTube basically about my father, Sonny Franzese, that was filmed by, or produced, I should say, by Newsday, which is a major newspaper out in Long Island, New York. It was a newspaper that early on in our lives did not treat us well. I would say this, that there was an article written about my dad, I think it was in the early 60s, for sure the early 60s, by a reporter by the name of Bob Green. The title of the article was "The Hood in Your Neighborhood." It was a front page article, huge article, a couple of pages, and it was really that article that brought my dad to the forefront. That's when he became somewhat of a media star in infamy, I would say. Nobody really knew who he was in the neighborhood until that article hit, and from that point on, it was just a snowstorm of media for my dad, and I always say he was kind of like the John Gotti of his day. Well, a couple of years back, I think it was 2017, something like that, when my dad got out of prison at the age of 100. Two reporters, one Bob Cassidy Jr., his father was a fighter, professional fighter, Bob Cassidy. I knew him pretty well, my dad knew him. He works for Newsday, and he approached me and he said they wanted to do this documentary series on my father. And I said, well, my dad's home, but I don't know if he's going to speak to you. You can try it. My dad did end up speaking with them, interviewing with them when he was 101 years old, 102 years old. So you can view the series. I never watched it. I interviewed for it, I answered a lot of their questions, spoke about my dad, but I never really watched it until now. And it's hard for me to watch. They went in depth about a lot of things, about our family dynamics, about how our family was ruined. It's called American Gangster, by the way. And it was very disturbing to me in many, many reasons. People, I tell you this, I lived a very turbulent childhood. Now, you might have heard me in the past say, hey, my childhood was great, because I don't like to talk too much about those kind of personal things that involve my family early on in my life. But I can tell you it was a difficult situation in my home, and you'll look at some of this and it's documented, and I can tell you there were a lot of things that I didn't agree with. The reporter, her name was Sandra, nice lady, but some of the things I think she missed and didn't report properly. It was troublesome to see it. They talked a lot about my mother, my sister, my brothers, a lot about my dad and his image, some things that were flattering of him, other things that weren't too flattering. It was the family stuff that was difficult for me to watch. I'm not going to get into that now. I will get into it at another time. I picked out certain things that I think were important to talk about, but one thing I do want to talk about that's kind of disturbing in a way. I did a YouTube video on murder a little while back, and I can tell you I was surprised. I was a little bit, if the word should be, disturbed, but that video got more videos than almost anything else that I've ever done. It seems like the topic of murder is just something that people are intrigued about, interested about. I've been asked about it 1,000 times. Michael, you're a made guy. Did you ever kill anybody? Anytime I go to speak anywhere, I open it up for a Q&A. One of the top questions, Michael, have you ever killed anybody? So it's a subject that, people seem to be very interested in. I want to talk about one part of this Newsday series that talks about my dad's murder case. And I want to kind of set it up for you. I was a young kid. This was the early 60s. I was 9 or 10 years old, and it was probably 6 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden, we hear a rapid knock on the door. We're all sleeping. My dad was home, mom was home, all the kids, and we hear a boom, 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 boom on the door, and we hear sirens and people yelling on a whatever you call that thing, a foghorn or whatever the heck it was. And I look out the window and there's police cars and unmarked cars and lights all over and guys out there with guns and rifles. And I'm saying, what the heck is going on? Now, obviously, I knew who my dad was, but I never seen a scene like this. And bang, bang, bang on the door. They came to arrest my dad on the murder of a fellow by the name of Ernie the Hawk Ruppolo. They called him the Hawk. Who was Ernie Ruppolo? But let me get to this for a minute. So, very scary situation. My mother was, hysterical. My brothers and sisters, it woke up the entire house. I remember I went down. My dad said, go downstairs and open the door for them. I did. I went down and I said, my dad's getting dressed. I was 9, 10 years old. I said, he'll be coming down. My father did get dressed rapidly, went down the stairs. They had rifles on him. It was a scene. My mother was holding one of my little sisters. My brother John, I think, was 2 years old. He was crying. It was really a scene. And they take my father away. The whole neighborhood woke up. That's how dramatic it was. You got police lights flaring everywhere, guys with guns. What's going on? So they take him away on this murder case of Ernie the Hawk Ruppolo. Who was Ernie the Hawk Ruppolo? He was a mob guy. He was with the Genovese crew. He wasn't with my dad's family, the Colombos, at that time. And what happened, he had been an informant, so we were told, on Vito Genovese. That was the word out. Vito Genovese had gone away. He had left the country because he was indicted on a murder case that he later beat, and he came back to America to assume control of the Genovese family from Frank Costello. That's kind of the setup. And when Genovese came back, and Ruppolo was still around because he had thought he had had this beat because Vito was never coming back, but he beats the case, he does come back, and now the Hawk is there. And maybe he thinks that, he's going to slide through this thing because maybe Vito didn't know that he was an informant, something like that. Anyhow, the word that I understood, that I heard from people close, to the source, was that Vito asked Joe Colombo to do him this favor and kill Ernie the Hawk Ruppolo. Wanted him dead. The way the story went is that Colombo went to my father, who was either a capo regime or the underboss at the time, I'm not sure, asked my father to put the hit out on Ruppolo. Now, my dad never told me this. I heard this from other sources. My dad told me he never knew Ernie, which I believe. He didn't have to know him if he was given a contract on him. You don't know somebody sometimes. Might have known who he was and heard something. My dad said he was innocent. He had nothing to do with it, and the whole case was a farce. So Dad gets indicted. They hold him in Queens. He was held without bail. All I remember is my mom going to court every day. She was a nervous wreck when the trial finally happened. My dad was in jail for several months. I visited him in the county jail during that time while they were waiting trial, and the trial begins. And I got to tell you, it was a scary situation. I did go to the courthouse 2 or 3 times, and only because I wanted to. I was that type of kid. Hey, I want to see what's going on. It was my dad. I didn't believe my dad was a murderer at that time. I wasn't involved in his life in any way. I was a kid going to school. But it was my father. I loved him, and I wanted to see what was going on. Initially, they didn't want me to go, but they kind of gave in. Okay, Mike, if you think you can handle it, we're going to let you go. Went to the courtroom a couple of times, and I was stunned by some of the testimony I heard. The guys that got on the stand and testified against my father were drug addicts, junkies. Now, I knew my father from the time I could remember, from the time I could hear or talk or speak or understand, preached against drugs for me. He hated drugs. He would make up stories about drugs to try to put the fear of God in me so that I would never take a drug. And you know what? It was effective because until this very moment, at 70 years old, I have never tried marijuana. I have never taken a drug. I've never got involved in any way, shape, or form with drugs because I believe of the fact that my father from an early age put that fear in me. One of the many good things that he taught me. Now, obviously, it was in my family to a horrible degree. Don't have to get into that. Sister died of an overdose of drugs. Brother John, devastated by drugs. And I listened to the testimony, and I can name their names, Park, Zayer, Smith, Cordero, bad guys. And I heard that these were drug addicts, and I looked at them, and I said, my father wouldn't associate with somebody like this. He had preached against drugs his whole life. But they started to tell the story basically of how my father ordered the killing. He wasn't involved in the killing physically, but he ordered it through his men, the men that were underneath him, Whitey Florio, Johnny Irish, guys that I knew as Uncle Whitey, Uncle Johnny. I didn't see any of them as murderers. Now remember, I'm telling you this through the eyes of a 9, 10-year-old kid. And I'm in the courtroom and I'm listening to this, and I'm listening to the prosecutor, point fingers at my dad on these 3 occasions that I went to court. And it was devastating, and I knew that if my father were to be convicted, he was going away for the rest of his life. He was going to get a life sentence. There was no doubt about it. And they showed pictures. I'll never forget. They had a big easel, and whatever you call it, easel, a board. And they had pictures of the body. Because what happened, this was a gruesome killing. From what I understand, and from what the testimony was, he was shot 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. He was knifed, maybe 20, 25, 30 times. He was wrapped in cellophane, the body was. It was chained and cinder blocked. And they had these photos, up on the screen. And the prosecutor was describing, and the coroner was describing, the death and how it took place and all this kind of stuff, right? It was gruesome. Well, what they also said that the mistake, whoever the perpetrators were of this murder, the mistake was that even though they wrapped it in foil, they shot him 7, 8, 9, 10 times, they stabbed him 12, 15, 20 times, whatever the number was. What they didn't do was pierce the lungs and some of the organs. And even though it was weighted down and chained in cinder blocks, the body rose to the shore in the Jamaica Bay. That's where the body was deposited. And it rose up to the shore and it was discovered. And that's how the whole murder case came about, because they discovered the body, they identified him from the dental records. It was very scary, man. And I would not at that point believe that my father could perpetrate a crime like that. I couldn't believe that Uncle Whitey or Uncle Johnny could perpetrate a crime like that. Just couldn't believe it. And by the way, Ernie the Hawk was a bad guy, had a bad reputation. A twist to this is that Ernie the Hawk was married, to a woman by the name of Eleanor. And Eleanor later on became the wife of John Cordero, who was the major witness against my father in this case and against my father in the bank robbery case that he was eventually convicted of in federal court and sentenced to 50 years on. Listen to this. The wife of the victim becomes the wife of one of the alleged perpetrators of the crime, John Cordero, because he was in on this whole crime. Figure this out. That in itself, when I processed this, didn't sound right. It didn't sound right. You're married to the victim, and then you're married to one of the people involved in killing your husband, and yet you're blaming my father. Now, I knew one thing. I did not believe in any way, shape, or form that my father could be involved with these 4 witnesses that were all admitted junkies. None of them were Italian, by the way. Not to say that my father didn't deal with people other than Italian, but they weren't his type of people. And when they testified later on at the bank robbery case, and I was a little older, it became even more apparent to me that this was a frame-up. I don't believe my father had anything to do with this murder case, and I know for a fact he wasn't involved in the bank robbery case. Anyway, the trial goes on. One of the days that I was there, I'll never forget, they had a wheelbarrow, and they made a big spectacle out of this. And by the way, the courtroom was sold out every day. You couldn't get a seat. It was like kind of first come, first serve, but you couldn't get a seat in the courthouse. It was that busy. But obviously, the family, we got seats. One day, the prosecutor is describing something. His name was Mosley, I'll never forget. And they walk in there with a wheelbarrow and the chains and the cinder block that were around the body. And they bring it and they put it right in the middle of the courtroom for everybody to see. Well, it was an eerie feeling seeing those chains and those cinder blocks. But the amazing thing for me at that age, because I loved my father so much, all I could feel was contempt and hatred for the witnesses, for the prosecutor, for the police officers that were part of the investigation, even at that age. So it shows you how young you can form things in your head, and how at that time I already started to really have a dislike, a hatred, a mistrust for law enforcement. It was really out of this case, this trial, that really got it to me, because how can you accuse my father of something like this? Now, of course, I'm young, I'm naive, this is my dad, and I didn't want to believe it. I just couldn't believe that my father, my loving father, would perpetrate something like this. That made a huge impression on me. It was the last time that I did come to the courtroom after that because my father didn't want me there. He said, you know, he saw that this was really impacting me. My mom didn't want me there anymore. Anyway, what happens in this case, very dramatic. And by the way, Life magazine did a story on this murder case way back when, in the 60s. It was the biggest story ever written in Life magazine, certainly to that point, and I think forever. It was a huge story, something like 29 pages with photographs and everything else. So that's the kind of sensational trial this was. It was covered every day in the news. Well, anyway, what happens is the closing arguments were coming up. They were ready to wrap up the case. All the evidence had been presented by the prosecution and the defense put on their defense. They're ready to wrap it up, and the judge receives a letter from an inmate on death row, a guy by the name, I think his name is Walter Schur, that said they had critical information to bring to this case. Well, I want to tell you something. I like this judge because another judge could have buried it. I never seen it. I haven't seen any letter. I don't know what it is. Could have not have allowed it in, but this judge felt compelled to allow this man to testify. He comes in at the midnight hour and he makes a statement. I wasn't in the courtroom that day, but he says that he knows the truth, that another fella, I think by the name of Rapacki, revealed to him that he was the actual killer of Ernie the Hawk Rapolo, and that Sonny Franzese had nothing to do with it. Now, that turned the trial around. I don't know if there would have been a conviction prior to that testimony, but there was no conviction after that testimony. My dad and everyone else was acquitted on all charges. He beat the case. He was released from prison that day. Huge celebration. I remember he went to the Copacabana that night and he had a celebration. We heard about it at home. We were thrilled. I mean, it was just, we got the phone call that he was acquitted. It was all over the news. It was huge. It was dynamic testimony. I don't know if he would have been convicted or acquitted had that testimony not come in. But anyway, it was a positive result. And of course, the indication and the implication, even in this Newsday document, is that somebody got to this Schur and they paid him off and he came in and gave this testimony, whatever. But the prosecution had a chance to cross-examine him. They did, and the jury believed him. So whatever, his information and his testimony was credible to the jury. They believed him. So as a result, my father beats a murder case. Had he not beaten that case, my dad would have been in prison for the rest of his life. He still would have went to trial on the federal case. He still would have gotten his 50 years, so he would have been doing life in the state and 50 years in the feds, and guaranteed he would have died in prison. As a result of him being acquitted in that case, my father was released from prison on the federal case at the age of 100, and he passed away at the age of 103. So, once again, my dad was allegedly an enforcer. Unfortunately, they have my dad on tape from an informant saying that he, quote, killed a lot of guys. I can tell you that my dad never admitted to me ever, not one time, that he was involved in any murder. I'm not saying that he wasn't, but I'm telling you that he never talked about it, he never admitted it, and as far as I'm concerned, I can't point my finger at my father in any particular case. Once I got into the life, our discussions were a little bit different about things that were going on while we were both made guys. I'm not going to get into that. I gave a pretty good video talk, I think, about this prior to today. The fascination that people have with murder and gangsters in that life, I can tell you that the old-timers didn't talk about it. Carmine Persico never talked to me about murders that he might have committed. I'm sure Carlo Gambino didn't brag about it and talk about it. People ask me about Sammy. Look, what happened with Sammy became public information. I don't think Sammy wears it as a badge of courage. I've listened to him at some times. I don't think he does that. And I'm glad that he doesn't. He admitted what he'd admitted, and that was it. And I think Sammy believes it's an unfortunate part of his time in that life. I really do believe that. But that's it. Again, I'm going to comment some more on these videos because the Newsday series, I should say, because it was so disturbing to me. I'm going to talk about some of the things they said with respect to my family, but I'm going to leave you with this. I've told you this in other videos and other talks, and I've said it 1,000 times. I don't glorify my former life. I consider my former life an evil life. And the reason I say that is because it's very destructive to families. I don't know of any family including my own, that hasn't been totally devastated, any family of a member of that life. When I say my own, not my wife and kids, but my mother, brothers and sisters, devastated. We lived a very, very tough life because of my father's involvement, because of his high profile, because of his many cases, because of his imprisonment. It's devastating to families. And that's why I always encourage young people, gangbangers, get out of the life, get off the street, do something productive and legitimate with your life. It's the only way to live your life, because life is tough enough when everything is good. We had a pandemic out of nowhere. People were devastated for the last year and a half. There were deaths, there were broken families, there were businesses destroyed, there were riots, everything. And nobody knew. And those people, innocent people, became victims, because life just has that way of doing things. Even when everything is good in your life, they can take a bad twist, but when you do the wrong thing and you suffer consequences, you put so much baggage on your life to carry around. And I've seen so many families and people get devastated as a result of bad decisions they made and severe consequences that were suffered as a result. I encourage you and I implore you, don't let it happen to you. And again, join.michaelfranzese.com. We're going to help you try to live a good life in every way. That's what we're there. That's what I've been doing for the last 25 years all over the world. So we're going to get more into this. I have some more to say about another video in this documentary series that was very disturbing, talking about my family life, that I want to clarify. But that's it for today. Thank you for subscribing. We're getting close to breaking the 700,000 subscriber mark, and I really appreciate it. I really mean that. Thank you for liking the content. We work hard at trying to give you the best that we have to offer, and we're going to continue to do that. We got a lot of good stuff coming up, a lot of good interviews that you're going to enjoy. So that's it. Stay tuned for Mafia Democracy, my next book coming out. How do I always leave you? Same way. Be safe. Be healthy. God bless all of you, and God willing, I will see you next time. Take care.